One day, God decided that humanity was simply too much, so he sent a flood to drown us all. A man built a boat and filled it with animals, and so life was saved. Today, that man is called Noah, but his name used to be Utanapishtim, and before that it was Atrahasis. This man of many names, for well over 1,000 years before he came to be called Noah in Jerusalem, was writing out the flood in Nineveh and in Babylon, and before that in Sippar. We have been speaking of the flood for as long as we have recorded speech, and we do it today in 2025, perhaps with more urgency than ever before. They say that the sea might rise by a meter in the next century, something like that, and when it does, whose fault will it be? Adonai willed it, to be sure, and before that, Enlil would have been the one to blame. We have weathered so many floods. My name is Dr. Teresa Kadish, and today I want to look at a few different versions of this flood myth. One that was found in Sippar, dated to the 1600s BCE, one that was found in Nineveh and dated to around 1000 BCE, and of course the one that's found in the Torah, which was canonized a few centuries after that. These stories clearly come from the same mythic tradition, with similarities not just in plot structure, but also in linguistic details. But while they all come from the same lineage, they diverge in how they speak about the god-king who's causing the flooding and how he's spoken to. And these differences have predictable theological impacts on the people doing the speaking, including you and me. We're going to start with the oldest myth, where the flood hero's name is Atrahasis, and then track the myth forward in time until we get to Noah in the book of Genesis, and then we'll do some compare and contrast to track the myth's evolution. And along the way, we'll talk about what it might be like to be a god so angry you would drown all of humanity, and what it might be like to be a god caring enough to challenge his authority to do so. What would that be like? Let's find out. Version 1. Atrahasis. Our story begins in the time before there were people, when the high gods enslaved the low gods to dig the channels of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The low gods rebel, as slaves do, and they surround the house of their king, Enlil, and he agrees to let them make a new authority and asks Mami, the birth goddess, to make human beings to bear the yoke. After 4,000 years, we are still calling her Mami. I think she's the most important character in this myth. Here's why. They institute regular sacrifices on the 1st, 7th, and 15th days of the month to purify the gods and reinforce their new world order. The leader of the rebellion is sacrificed, and his blood is mixed with a man's. Let that same god and man be thoroughly mixed in the clay. Let us hear the drumbeat for the rest of time. From the flesh of the god let a spirit remain. Let it make the living know its sign, lest he be forgotten. Let the spirit remain. From this point forward, rather than the low gods doing Enlil's drudgery, now that's the role of humanity. And the humans start making babies. They're fruitful. They multiply. For 1,200 years, the people toil. 1,200 years had not gone by. The land had grown numerous. The peoples had increased. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their clamor. He said to the great gods, "The clamor of humankind has become burdensome to me. I am losing sleep to their uproar." Enlil, the king of the gods, is disturbed. He can't sleep. His slaves are being too loud. So he decides to kill them all. First, he sends a plague, and the people start dying. Enki, the god of wisdom, thinks this is a bad idea. Imagine that. The king of the gods is wrong. Enki speaks to Atrahasis, his prophet basically, and Atrahasis tells the people to make grain sacrifices to the god of sickness, and the people will be healed. This works for 1,200 years or so, but the enslaved people are still being too loud, and King Enlil still can't sleep, so he sends a drought. And it's still a bad idea. Wise Enki then instructs Atrahasis to make grain sacrifices to the rain god, and the drought abates, but the people are still being too loud, so King Enlil tries to drown them all. This time he makes Enki swear an oath that he won't help Atrahasis, but wise Enki helps him anyway. I can only assume because Enki thinks that a catastrophic flood is a bad idea. Bad king. So Enki tells Atrahasis to build a boat to withstand the deluge. "Flee house, build boat, forsake possessions, and save life. The boat that you will build, cover her with tarps. roof her over like the depths, so that the sun will not see inside her. The pitch should be firm. Make her strong. I imagine you can guess what happens next. Atrahasis makes sacrifices and then brings his animals and his family on board as the storm begins, bringing whatever he had. Pure animals he slaughtered, cattle, fat animals he killed, sheep he chose and brought on board the birds flying in the heavens, the cattle of the cattle god, the creatures of the steppe he brought on board. The outlook of the weather changed. Adad began to roar in the clouds. The god, they heard his clamor. He brought pitch to seal the door. By the time he had bolted his door, Adad was roaring in the clouds. The winds were furious as he set forth. He cut the mooring rope. He released the boat. Meanwhile, while Atrahasis floats on the waves, the scene shifts to the perspective of the gods. They're frightened by what's happening. One person did not see another. They could not recognize each other in the catastrophe. The offspring became like flies. The gods became afraid of the clamor of the deluge. They took refuge in heaven. They crouched outside. Anu became afraid of the clamor of the deluge. It was terrifying the gods. And here is why I think Mommy is the most important character in this story. Because she doesn't accept that this flood was inevitable or righteous. The gods are hungry now because there's no humans making sacrifices to them, and Mommy curses the fact that she was forced to agree to this catastrophe. Mommy, the great lady, gnawed her lips in agony. The Anuna, the great gods, were sitting in thirst and hunger. The goddess saw it, weeping. The midwife of the gods, the wise Mommy, said, "In the assembly of the gods, how did I agree with them on annihilation? Was Enlil so strong that he forced me to speak? Did he make my speech confused? Of my own accord, from myself alone, to my own charge, I have heard my people's clamor. My offspring, with no help from me, have become like flies. And as for me, how to dwell in this abode of grief? My clamor fallen silent. Shall I go up to heaven? I would take up my dwelling in a well-larded house. Where has Anu gone to? The chief decision-maker whose sons, the gods, headed his command? He who irrationally brought about the flood and relegated the peoples to catastrophe." Mommy isn't afraid to criticize what's happening, and she grieves. She calls the god king irrational, and the other gods agree with her. She wept, giving vent to her feelings. While Mommy wailed, her emotion was spent. The gods wept with her for the land. She had her full of woe. She was thirsty for beer. Where she sat weeping, they too sat. Like sheep, they filled a stream bed. Their lips were agonized with thirst. They were suffering pangs of hunger. During the flood, without the regular sacrifices from the people, the gods were starving. Mommy curses the god king in heaven, secure in his well-larded house. His actions have not just hurt the people, they've also hurt the other gods. They gather in a dry stream bed, agonized with thirst. Mommy wants beer offerings. But luckily, Atrahasis has survived, and he starts making sacrifices again. To the four winds he cast. He was raining down food. The gods sniffed the savor. They were gathered like flies around the offering. In her gratitude for making his sacrifice, Mommy makes a proclamation. She again denounces King Enlil for bringing on the flood, and she ties a necklace around her neck and promises to remember. Mommy arose to rail against all of them. Where has Anu come to, the chief decision-maker? Has Enlil drawn nigh the incense? They, who irrationally brought about the flood and relegated the peoples to catastrophe? Mine is their woe. Proclaim my destiny. Then she drew nigh the big fly ornaments and said, "Let these flies be like jewelry around my neck, that I may remember it every day and forever." At this point, King Enlil gets angry. He's kind of always angry. He blames wise Enki for saving humanity once again and insists on restitution. The warrior Enlil was filled with anger at the Igigi gods. "All we great Anuna resolved together on an oath. Where did life escape? How did a man survive the catastrophe? Who could do this but Enki?" Enki made ready to speak and said to the great gods, "I did it, indeed, for your sakes.
I am responsible for safeguarding life.
So Enlil, realizing he will not be able to eliminate all humans, insists instead on another kind of population control, by structuring the lives of women. He commands Mami to create baby-snatching demonesses, and also non-reproductive social roles for women, priestesses. Enlil says,
You, birth goddess, creatress of destinies, establish death for all peoples. Among the people are the woman who has borne, and the woman who has not borne. Let there be also among the people the she-demon. Let her snatch the baby from the lap of her who bore it. Establish high priestesses and priestesses. Let them be taboo, and so cut down childbirth. The cloistered woman, the sacrosanct woman.
And here, this version of the flood myth comes to an end with a summary. How we brought about the flood, but man survived the catastrophe. May the Igigi gods hear. I have sung of the flood to all the peoples. Listen. So in this earliest version, God King Enlil resolves to drown everyone, and he's thwarted by the wise Enki, who tells Atrahasis to build a boat, and he's denounced by the midwife Mami, who promises to remember the catastrophe with her necklace. This story was told and retold and told again across the ancient world for thousands of years. Version 2. Utanapishtim. This is a replica of Tablet 11 from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a later version of this flood myth. This tablet was found in Nineveh in the library of the Neo-Assyrian king Assurbanipal, and in this version, the flood hero's name is Utanapishtim, although sometimes the text reverts to calling him Atrahasis again. The text frequently quotes earlier versions directly, although some of the details are changed or added. For example, the call to build the boat follows the familiar pattern. Wreck house, build boat, forsake possessions, and seek life. Belongings reject, and life save. Take aboard the boat seed of all living things. The boat you shall build, let her dimensions be measured out. Let her width and length be equal. Roof her over, like the watery depths. Utanapishtim builds the boat, makes the sacrifices, and the deluge begins. And once again, the goddess dissents. No one could see the one next to him. The people could not recognize one another in the downpour. The gods became frightened of the deluge. They shrank back, went up to Anu's highest heaven. The gods cowered like dogs, crouching outside. Ishtar screamed like a woman in childbirth, and sweet-voiced Belit Ili wailed aloud. Would that day had come to naught, when I spoke up for evil in the assembly of the gods. How could I have spoken up for evil in the assembly of the gods, and spoken up for battle to destroy my people? It was I myself who brought my people into the world. Now, like a school of fish, they choke up the sea. The supreme gods were weeping with her. The gods sat where they were, weeping. Their lips were parched, taking on a crust. So in this version too, the gods starve when the people can't make sacrifices, and the goddess grieves for her people, and right on cue, the flood abates, Utanapishtim has survived, and he makes offerings of gratitude. When the seventh day arrived, I brought out a dove and set it free. The dove went off and returned. No landing place came into its view, so it turned back. I brought out a swallow and set it free. The swallow went off and returned. No landing place came to its view, so it turned back. I brought out a raven and set it free. The raven went off and saw the ebbing of the waters. It ate, preened, left droppings, did not turn back. I released all to the four directions. I brought out an offering and offered it to the four directions. The gods smelled the savor. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods crowded round the sacrifice like flies. In this version, we get an extra detail that Utanapishtim sent out birds as the flood subsided, a pattern that Noah will soon repeat. Utanapishtim makes sacrifices, and once the gods have all eaten, the goddess again calls King Enlil irrational for trying to drown everyone. She specifically says that he doesn't deserve to receive any sacrifices, because he's an idiot, and she promises to wear a necklace in remembrance. As soon as Belit Ili arrived, she held up the great fly ornaments that Anu had made in his ardor. "O gods, these shall be my lapis necklace, lest I forget. I shall be mindful these days and not forget, not ever. The gods should come to the incense offering, but Enlil should not come to the incense offering, for he irrationally brought on the flood and marked my people for destruction. Enlil does not like being called out this time either, and he flies into a rage, asking why his plans for total destruction were foiled again, and insists on future population controls. But he does make Utanapishtim immortal, so that's kind of a consolation prize. Version 3. Noah. A similar version of this myth was being actively retold and edited in the Neo-Babylonian Empire during the time of the Jewish exile in Babylon. So it shouldn't be surprising that the story made its way into the Torah. But the Torah famously has just one God, meaning that all of the divine roles in the previous versions, the murderous King Enlil, the plan-foiling Enki, the grieving Mami, all have to be played by a single character, the Israelite God, Adonai. And this recasting of the script is simultaneously theologically brilliant and deeply contradictory. For example, at the start of Noah's narrative, Adonai sounds a lot like King Enlil. And Adonai was sorry that he had made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So Adonai said, "I will destroy man, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." But then, literally in the next sentence, he sounds like Enki. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Adonai. Likewise Enki, Adonai then tells Noah to build an ark, and seal it with pitch, and fill it with offerings and other animals to keep them all alive. The plot details are the same as before, but the character dynamics are transformed. Instead of there being dissent, or something like a good cop, bad cop situation between Enki and Enlil, instead we get a highly judgmental single God who on his own decides that Noah is righteous and everyone else is evil and deserves to be drowned. "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me." And all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on earth 40 days and 40 nights. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. Here, in this version of the story, the voice of the goddess Mami is edited out completely. No one tells Adonai that he's made a mistake. No one cries that he's irrational and undeserving of sacrifices. No one grieves. Adonai's genocidal authority goes unquestioned. So, he destroyed all living things. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. Then, after the flood is over, like Utanapishtim before him, Noah sets free birds. He sent out a raven, which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. And again, he sent out the dove from the ark. The dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth, and Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. So he waited another 7 days, and sent out the dove, which did not return again to him anymore. And at this point in the earlier stories, Utanapishtim and Atrahasis both leave their boats and make sacrifices, so of course Noah does the same. Then Noah built an altar to Adonai, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar, and the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. But while in the earlier stories, here Mami then puts on a necklace and promises to always remember, jewelry is a little too girly for our Lord Adonai, so instead he opts for a rainbow. "I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be that when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature. The waters will never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." So a scene that in the original narratives had a protesting goddess with a necklace as her memory of abuse is replaced with a similar scene, but with no goddess, and a rainbow signifying that although Adonai is murderous, he's committed to us in a special way, God's chosen people. The early Jewish storytellers who modified this narrative did something remarkable. They transformed three arguing gods, Enlil, Enki, and Mami, with three very different relationships to humanity, into a single moral force who could somehow want to eliminate all humans and also want to save them in the same breath. And for most readers of Noah's story, this does not seem contradictory. That's the genius of monotheism, showing that all the good that's in the world and all the bad comes from the same source. It's very powerful theology. But when we seriously consider the ways that these gods were able to disagree with each other in earlier versions of the story, we can begin to see what had to be sacrificed in order for this specifically Jewish worldview to evolve. It's not just that the voice of the goddess was silenced and her perspective eliminated. With her went the idea that the king of the gods could be questioned at all. We lost all of the gods who challenged the king's perspective, and so we're left with the inevitable conclusion that when something bad happened, like a natural disaster or a genocide, Adonai willed it, and it's our fault for not following his commandments properly. The Babylonian exile was our fault. The destruction of the Second Temple was our fault. The Holocaust was our fault. Climate change is certainly our fault. There are lots of Jews alive today who think like this, and I do think there's something valuable to it. It's a perspective that emphasizes our free will and encourages us to acknowledge the places in our life where we are indeed responsible for the trouble that we're in, even if we don't want to admit it. But there's also something about the image of an unquestionable God king who decides who lives and who dies that's a little, I don't know, victim-blamey. Or there's something about King Enlil's motivations in the earlier stories which feels, to me, more emotionally honest. He sends the flood because he's grumpy. People are being loud and he can't sleep, like when you swat flies in the night that are buzzing in your ear. In some ways, I think that that kind of violence is a lot more understandable than righteous destruction. And it leaves room for Mami's grief. No one mourns all those who drowned in Noah's story. Not Noah, not Adonai. Who else remains to feel for them? All of which is to say that I think there's something quite valuable in these earlier versions of the flood myth. They contain meanings which were forgotten by many of our ancestors, but which we, with our modern perspectives and access to these pre-Jewish stories, can begin to remember. These stories can remind us that God is allowed to be flawed too, and that he has a feminine side. He used to like jewelry. Can you imagine that? We can understand the deluge and the oncoming climate catastrophe and every tragedy in between less as a moral judgment of our characters and more as the complex outcome of a world with many voices, many of which have not been heard for far too long. There's a goddess in these tablets who I think is worth listening to. Thanks for giving her a bit of your attention. This video is part of a class I'm teaching on Bronze Age mythology. There's links in the description to all of the sources that I used. This week I relied a lot on translations by Benjamin Foster. Next week we'll be discussing a Sargon of Akkad and the story of how he was sent down the river in a wicker basket 1,000 years before Moses. Click the subscribe button so you won't miss it, and I'll see you there.